February 1943. A Spitfire pilot climbs to 18,000 feet over the English Channel. His canopy fogs from the inside. He cannot see the enemy. He cannot see his wingman. He snaps into a sharp left roll on instinct and narrowly avoids colliding with another aircraft from his own squadron. 3 pilots had died that week, not from enemy fire, but from blindness. One man believed the problem was not the weather but the aircraft itself, and he was about to defy every established rule to prove it. The winter of 1943 was merciless over Northern Europe. RAF Fighter Command operated in air so cold that moisture from a pilot's breath froze onto cockpit glass within seconds. It happened during climbs, during dives, when adrenaline surged and breathing accelerated, precisely when visibility mattered most. Pilots called it the White Death. Not poetic, just exact. You could not dogfight what you could not see. You could not navigate home through cloud if your instruments were obscured. You could not bail out if you did not know which way was up. Standard procedure was to crack the canopy. Let the freezing slipstream pour inside. The fog vanished instantly, but the cockpit became a 300-mile-per-hour wind tunnel. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero. Fingers went numb. Oxygen masks iced over. Frostbite became routine. Some pilots endured entire sorties with canopies open, returning with raw skin, bloodshot eyes, and speech slurred by cold. Ground crews wrapped them in blankets and guided them toward the medical tent. Flight surgeons logged it as cold exposure. Command logged it as acceptable loss. But the numbers were unforgiving. Between December 1942 and March 1943, Fighter Command recorded 37 incidents of spatial disorientation caused by canopy fogging. 11 ended in crashes. 8 resulted in mid-air collisions. The rest concluded with aborted intercepts, missed engagements, and enemy bombers slipping through unchallenged. German pilots were aware of this. Luftwaffe intelligence briefed its squadrons on British cold weather vulnerabilities. German fighters drew Spitfires into climbs, then vanished into cloud, waiting for the British to lose visual reference, to panic, to make a mistake. It was not innovation, it was exploitation. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tried everything. Anti-fog pastes that smeared, heated glass panels that cracked, ventilation ducts that froze solid. Each attempted solution added weight, complexity, or new failure points. None worked under combat conditions. Pilots adapted. They breathed shallowly. They tilted their heads to peer through clear patches. They memorized instrument layouts to fly blind. Resourceful, courageous, and unsustainable. At RAF Tangmere, a maintenance officer named Peter Holloway watched pilot after pilot return from sorties shaking, exhausted, frostbitten. He was not a designer or an aerodynamicist. He was a career ground officer who had started as a rigger, progressed through hydraulics and fuel systems, and now oversaw a squadron's daily airworthiness. His responsibility was simple: keep 30 fighters mission ready. And at that moment, the greatest threat was not enemy fire, it was condensation. Holloway began asking questions. Why did the canopy fog? Because warm, moist air inside the cockpit met cold glass. Why was the air moist? Pilots exhaled water vapor. Why could it not escape? Cockpits were sealed for aerodynamics and pressurization. Why not leave them open? Open canopies created drag, turbulence, and hypothermia. The logic looped endlessly. Every solution created another problem. Holloway started to suspect the issue was not heat or ventilation at all, it was airflow. The cockpit was fighting itself. Warm air rose. Cold air sank. Moisture collected between them, trapped. He walked the flight line at dawn, observing aircraft as crews prepared them for sortie. He noticed something subtle. When canopies were slid back on the ground, a thin line of frost formed along the interior rail where cold metal met warmer air. A boundary. A threshold. He wondered whether the same phenomenon occurred in flight, only faster, and across the entire glass surface. He began sketching, not formal drawings, just working ideas. What if that boundary could be controlled? What if cockpit airflow could be shaped to prevent stagnant air from lingering against the glass? What if, instead of sealing the canopy completely, a calculated leak, a narrow, controlled gap, allowed just enough cold air to flow across the surface to prevent condensation, but not enough to freeze the pilot? It seemed almost too simple, but Holloway had spent 15 years watching what succeeded and what failed. He knew the best solutions usually aligned with physics rather than opposing it. He brought the idea to his commanding officer. The reply was courteous but final. The canopy design had been tested and approved. Any modification required Air Ministry authorization. Unauthorized alterations were grounds for court-martial. There was a process, paperwork, committees, trials. It would take months. Holloway thanked him and returned to the hangar, fully aware what months meant: more pilots lost, more crashes, more coffins. Peter Holloway had been born in Coventry in 1908, in the shadow of the motorworks. His father built engines for Daimler. His uncle worked the factory floor at Armstrong's Italy. Dinner table conversations revolved around tolerances and torque specifications. By 12, Holloway could dismantle a magneto and explain ignition timing. He left school early, not from lack of aptitude, but because his family needed wages and the factories needed hands. At 14, he became an apprentice rigger at Hawker's Canberry Park Works, learning to stretch fabric over airframes, read grain and wood, and feel when a turnbuckle was tight enough but not too tight. It was hands-on work. Errors could kill. He excelled, methodical, patient, observant. By 18, he was lead rigger on biplanes. By 23, he transferred into hydraulics, mastering pressure systems, fluid behavior under temperature extremes, and how a single blocked valve could ground an aircraft. When war came, Holloway enlisted immediately. The RAF needed maintainers more than pilots, and he was posted to Tangmere as a flight sergeant. By 1941, he was a warrant officer. By 1943, he was maintenance officer for an entire squadron, responsible for airworthiness, repairs, and fault diagnosis under relentless conditions. Holloway never chased rank, he chased solutions. He became known for fixing what could not be fixed: cracked engine mounts, jammed gun britches, elusive hydraulic failures. He relied on reasoning, not manuals. His workshop was organized chaos: salvaged components on shelves, benches cluttered with calipers and sketches, a battered copy of Herner's Fluid Dynamics filled with pencil notes. At night, he read by lamplight while others played cards or wrote home. Pilots trusted him. He listened. Complaints, loose rudders, drifting compasses, stiff controls, were recorded and corrected. Holloway treated aircraft like patients. Every symptom had a cause. Every cause had a solution. But the fogging problem would not release him. It was not a broken component or a failed seal. It was embedded in the design itself. Design flaws were the hardest to solve. He spent evenings sitting inside grounded Spitfire cockpits, breathing steadily, watching condensation bloom and spread. It always began at the top of the canopy, where curvature was greatest and airflow slowest, creeping downward like a veil, thick near the frame, thinner at the center. He tested temperatures, pressing a thermometer against the glass at multiple points. The upper panels were coldest. The sides were marginally warmer. The center, where the pilot's head disrupted airflow, remained clear the longest. That mattered. The fogging was not random. It followed patterns. Holloway formed a hypothesis. If warm cockpit air could be directed across the glass in a thin, fast-moving layer, moisture would not have time to condense before being carried away. But it could not rely on heaters, they had failed. Fans were useless at altitude. The solution had to be passive, driven by the aircraft's speed rather than fighting it. His proposal was deceptively simple. Cut a narrow gap along the base of the canopy, just behind the windscreen. Let slipstream air enter in. A controlled stream shaped the interior surface so that air flowed upward across the glass and vented out through the existing rear cockpit gaps. It would create a curtain of moving air too fast for moisture to settle. The gap would need to be small, maybe a quarter inch. Any larger and you'd get turbulence, noise, and cold. Any smaller and you wouldn't move enough air. The placement would be critical. Too far forward and slipstream pressure would blast the pilot. Too far back and the air wouldn't reach the glass. It wasn't a major modification. It was a surgical one. A single cut, a shaped deflector, maybe an hour of work, but it wasn't authorized. And that made it dangerous not to the aircraft but to Holloway's career. He thought about submitting a formal proposal, filling out the forms, waiting for review. But he also thought about the pilot who'd come in that morning, hands still shaking, describing how he'd lost his section leader in cloud because his canopy had turned to milk. Holloway made a decision. He wouldn't ask permission. He'd prove the concept first, then present the results. If it worked, they'd forgive him. If it didn't, he'd take the consequences. He chose a Spitfire Mark VIBB that was grounded for hydraulic repairs. It wouldn't fly for 3 days, which gave him time. He worked at night alone using a jeweler's saw and a set of files. He cut a slot along the canopy rail, smoothed the edges, and fabricated a small aluminum deflector to guide the airflow upward. When he was done, the modification was nearly invisible. Unless you knew where to look, you'd never see it. That was intentional. If it failed, he could remove it and no one would know. But if it worked, everything would change. March 1943. The air war over Europe is entering its most desperate phase. The 8th Air Force is flying deep into Germany. The RAF is hitting industrial targets around the clock. Luftwaffe resistance is fierce, coordinated, and adaptive. Fighter Command's role is clear. Escort the bombers, intercept enemy formations, and maintain air superiority. Superiority means nothing if your pilots can't see, and increasingly they can't. The fogging problem is no longer anecdotal, it's statistical. Wing commanders review mission reports and see the same phrases repeated: lost visual contact, unable to identify target, abandoned pursuit due to visibility. In pilot debriefs, the phrase comes up again and again: canopy fogged. Some squadrons lose more aircraft to disorientation than to enemy fire. In one incident, 2 Spitfires collide during a defensive turn in cloud. Both pilots bail out, but one hits the tail on exit. In another, a section leader climbs through overcast, loses sight of his wingmen, and flies into a hillside. There are no bullet holes, just fog. Flight surgeons begin documenting cold injuries, frostbite, hypothermia, nerve damage in fingers and toes. Pilots who fly with canopies cracked for entire sorties return with core body temperatures below 95 degrees. Some can't grip the stick, some can't speak coherently, they're grounded until they warm up, sometimes for days. Ground crews try improvisation. They wrap cockpit frames in fabric to reduce cold spots. They smear gun oil on the glass. It works for 10 minutes, then smears into a greasy haze. They install makeshift heaters using exhaust bleed air. One catches fire, another cracks the canopy from thermal stress. Engineers at Farnborough run controlled tests in climate chambers. They cycle temperatures, vary humidity, measure dew points. Their conclusion is technically sound, but practically useless. The only reliable way to prevent fogging is to maintain cockpit temperature within 3 degrees of exterior glass temperature, which is impossible at altitude. One proposal suggests installing dual-pane canopies like insulated windows. The weight penalty is unacceptable. Another suggests chemically treated glass. The optical distortion is unacceptable. A third suggests pilot breathing tubes that vent exhalation directly overboard. The complexity is unacceptable. Every solution is either too heavy, too expensive, too fragile, or too slow to implement. The war won't wait for perfect engineering. Pilots are dying now. Holloway reads these reports when they filter down to station level. He sees the same pattern. Every proposal treats fogging as a thermodynamic problem. They're trying to change temperature, but temperature is a symptom, not the cause. The real problem is stagnation. Air that doesn't move becomes saturated. Saturated air condenses on cold surfaces. It's not about heat, it's about flow. He wonders why no one is talking about airflow management. Maybe because it's not elegant, maybe because it doesn't require new materials or exotic chemistry. Maybe because it's too simple to take seriously. Or maybe because no one with the authority to change design has ever sat in a freezing cockpit, breath clouding, altitude rising, and realized they're about to die because of condensation. Holloway knows that feeling. He's never flown combat, but he's flown test hops. He sat in cockpits during ground runs in January, watched his breath fog the glass, felt the cold seep through his jacket. He understands what it's like to fight your own aircraft. He also understands bureaucracy. The RAF is brilliant at logistics, at coordination, at mass production. But brilliance at scale often means rigidity. It means standardization. It means that a good idea from a maintenance officer at a forward airfield will be reviewed, debated, shelved, and forgotten while men continue to die. Unless the idea proves itself first, Holloway's modification is installed. The Spitfire is buttoned up and returned to the flight line. On paper, it's been repaired and cleared for service. No one has noticed the quart Aaron slot along the canopy base. No one has asked. Maintenance logs list hydraulic work, a magneto swap, and a routine inspection. Nothing about airflow. Now, he needs a test. But he can't just ask a pilot to fly it. If the modification causes a problem, turbulence, structural failure, canopy failure, the pilot could be killed, and Holloway would be responsible. He considers flying it himself. He's rated on single engine aircraft, but he hasn't flown in months, and he's never flown a Spitfire in combat conditions. If he crashes, the modification is buried, and the problem persists. He needs someone who trusts him, someone who understands risk, someone who's frustrated enough with the fogging problem to try something unauthorized. He finds that someone 3 days later. Flight Lieutenant James Cartwright is 24 years old and has 62 combat sorties to his name. He flies with precision and patience, traits that have kept him alive longer than most. But lately, he's been grounded more than he's flown. Not by command, by cold. 2 weeks ago, he escorted bombers to Lille. At 18,000 feet, his canopy fogged during a climbing turn. He cracked it open, cleared his vision, and immediately lost feeling in his left hand. By the time he landed, his fingers were white and wooden. Medical officers grounded him for 4 days. He returned to duty, flew another sortie, and had the same problem. This time he kept the canopy closed and tried to navigate by instrument. He lost his section in cloud and nearly collided with a Wellington. When he landed, he was reprimanded for breaking formation. He didn't argue, he just asked if there was a solution to the fogging. He was told to breathe shallow and keep the canopy cracked. Cartwright is the kind of pilot who doesn't complain. He follows orders. He trusts his aircraft. But he's also the kind who pays attention. He's noticed that the fogging isn't random. It happens at specific altitudes. It worsens during turns. It clears in dives. There's a pattern, and patterns mean there's a solution. When Holloway approaches him in the dispersal hut, Cartwright listens. Holloway doesn't oversell it. He just explains the logic. Air stagnates, moisture condenses. A controlled gap introduces flow. Flow prevents condensation. Simple. Cartwright asks the obvious question. Has it been tested? Holloway says no. Not in flight, but the physics are sound. Cartwright asks if it's approved. Holloway says no. Cartwright is quiet for a moment. Then he asks which aircraft. Holloway points to the Spitfire on the hard stand, the one with the fresh hydraulic repair. Cartwright walks over, runs his hand along the canopy rail, feels the gap. It's smooth, precise, almost invisible. He looks back at Holloway. He says he'll fly it. Holloway tells him he doesn't have to. If there's a problem, it's on Holloway, not him. Cartwright shakes his head. He's already lost 2 friends to disorientation. If there's a chance this works, it's worth the risk. They agree on a test protocol, a local flight. Climb to 20,000 feet, close the canopy, breathe normally, monitor visibility. If fogging occurs, abort, and return. If it doesn't, run through combat maneuvers and see if the effect holds. No paperwork, no official log, just a routine air test. If anyone asks, it's a post-maintenance check flight. The next morning, conditions are perfect for fogging. Temperature at altitude is forecast at -30, humidity at ground level is high. The kind of day where condensation is guaranteed. Cartwright suits up. Holloway runs a final walk around checking control surfaces, fuel, load, oxygen. Everything is standard except the canopy. He doesn't mention it to the ground crew. They wouldn't understand, and explaining would mean delays. Cartwright climbs in, straps down, runs through pre-start checks, engine start, gauges green, radio check. Tower clears him for departure. He taxis to the runway, runs up the engine, and releases brakes. The Spitfire accelerates, lifts, climbs into cold gray sky. Holloway watches from the dispersal, binoculars raised, jaw tight. Cartwright levels at 5,000 feet, canopy closed. He breathes normally, watches the glass clear. He climbs to 10,000, still clear. 15,000. A faint haze appears near the top edge, then dissipates. He feels a faint draft near his left shoulder, cold, but not painful. Just a whisper of slipstream. 20,000 feet he runs through a series of hard turns. Port, starboard, climb, dive. His breathing quickens. Normally, this is when the fogging starts. He waits. Nothing. The canopy stays clear. Not perfectly spotless, but clear enough. He can see his instruments. He can see the horizon. He can see the fields below. Patchwork green and brown through scattered cloud. He can see. He keys the radio and reports altitude, heading, and status. Tower acknowledges. He doesn't mention the visibility. Not yet, he needs to be sure. He stays aloft. For 40 minutes, he runs every maneuver he can think of. Loops, rolls, high G, turns, simulated intercepts, steep climbs, shallow glides. He breathes hard, deliberately fogging his oxygen mask, forcing moisture into the cockpit. The canopy remains clear. He descends, enters the circuit, and lands. As he taxis back, he sees Holloway standing by the hardstand, arms crossed, face unreadable. Cartwright cuts the engine, slides the canopy back, and climbs out. He pulls off his helmet. His face is cold, but not frozen. His hands are functional. His vision was perfect the entire flight. He looks at Holloway and says 2 words. It worked. Holloway doesn't celebrate. He listens to Cartwright's debrief, takes notes, asks detailed questions. At what altitude did you first notice the draft? Was there any turbulence? Could you hear the airflow? Did it affect control feel? Was the cold tolerable? Cartwright answers each one. The draft was noticeable, but not disruptive. No turbulence. A faint whistling sound at high speed, barely audible over the engine. Controls felt normal. The cold was present but manageable. Far better than flying with the canopy fully cracked. Holloway's mind is already running through the next steps. One successful test proves the concept, but it doesn't prove reliability. He needs data. Multiple flights, different pilots, different conditions. He needs to know if the modification works in rain, in combat stress, in sustained climbs, but he also knows he's on borrowed time. If command finds out he's altering airframes without authorization, the project ends and he ends up in front of a disciplinary board. He needs proof strong enough to override protocol. That means he needs more pilots willing to fly the modified aircraft. Cartwright volunteers to spread the word. Quietly, he talks to 2 other flight lieutenants, both of whom have had fogging incidents. They agree to fly test hops. Within a week, 5 pilots have flown the modified Spitfire. All report the same result: clear canopy, tolerable cold, no operational impact. One pilot, a Canadian named McKay, takes it into a mock dogfight with an unmodified aircraft. He outturns his opponent 3 times, not because of skill, but because he can see continuously, while the other pilot has to crack his canopy mid-engagement. McKay lands and tells Holloway he wants the same modification on his assigned aircraft. Holloway hesitates. Modifying one grounded airframe is one thing. Modifying operational fighters assigned to specific pilots is another. But McKay is insistent. He argues that if the modification improves combat effectiveness, withholding it is a greater risk than implementing it. Holloway agrees. He works at night modifying McKay's aircraft in 2 others. The cuts are clean, the deflectors fitted with precision. Each installation takes 90 minutes. By the end of the week, 4 Spitfires in the squadron have the modification. Officially, maintenance logs show routine inspections. Unofficially, a quiet revolution is underway. Pilots begin to notice the modified aircraft are in higher demand. Flight assignments start to favor them. During mission briefs, pilots ask which aircraft has the gap. Some call it the Holloway mod, others just call it the fix. The squadron's engineering officer eventually notices something. He's reviewing fuel consumption data and sees slight discrepancies in airspeed readings on certain aircraft. Not enough to indicate malfunction, but enough to suggest altered drag profiles. He inspects one of the modified Spitfires and finds the gap. He brings it to Holloway, asks what it is, asks who authorized it. Holloway tells him the truth. No1 had given formal approval. It was a field adaptation to fix the canopy fogging problem. It had been trialed. It worked. Pilots demanded it. The engineering officer found himself torn between regulations and results. He understood that unauthorized modifications were prohibited, yet he also recognized that fogging was endangering lives. He informed Holloway that he was required to report the modification, but added that he would postpone the report for 48 hours. This window allowed Holloway to escalate the issue himself, presenting it as a solution rather than an infraction. Holloway composed a report including test flight data, pilot testimonials, and technical schematics. He outlined the problem, the modification, and the outcomes. He offered no apology, requested no leniency, simply presented the facts and asked for formal evaluation. The report went to the station commander. 2 days later, Holloway was summoned. Expecting a reprimand, he instead found 3 men waiting: the station commander, a senior engineer from Farnborough, and a wing commander from Fighter Command Headquarters. They had reviewed the report, inspected the modified aircraft, and spoken to pilots. Questions followed. The Farnborough engineer asked about structural integrity. Had the canopy frame been compromised? Holloway explained that the gap was cut into the rail, not the frame, leaving load-bearing structures intact. Ground stress tests showed no weakening. The wing commander inquired about cold exposure. Were pilots at risk of hypothermia? Holloway provided temperature data from trial flights, showing cockpit temperatures dropped only an average of 4 degrees Fahrenheit, tolerable with standard flight gear and far safer than open canopies. The station commander asked the crucial question: does it work in combat? Holloway shared testimony from McKay and 2 others who had flown sorties with the modification. All reported clear, sustained visibility, no fogging, and no operational drawbacks. One pilot intercepted a Focke-Wulf he would otherwise have missed. Another maintained formation through clouds when he would have had to break off. Exchanging glances, the men considered the impact. The Farnborough engineer asked how quickly the change could be implemented across the fleet. Holloway estimated 1 hour per aircraft, minimal material cost, no special tools, and feasible for any qualified rigger. The wing commander leaned back and made a statement that changed everything: 10 aircraft, 2 squadrons, operational testing. If results matched the field reports, the modification would be deployed across Fighter Command. But Holloway would oversee installation and training at each station, ensuring uniformity. Success would credit him, failure would hold him accountable. Holloway agreed immediately. Within 2 weeks, 20 aircraft were modified. Within a month, 200. By June 1943, over 400 Spitfires across Fighter Command had the Holloway gap. Pilots no longer cracked their canopies. Cold injuries decreased, and visibility-related incidents dropped by 70%. The true measure of success, however, wasn't in statistics, it was in the missions that succeeded. Intercepts that would have failed now worked. Pilots returned safely because they could see. The modification spread faster than formal channels anticipated. Word passed from squadron to squadron, pilot to pilot, ground crew to maintainers. By autumn 1943, the modification was standard on frontline Spitfires and incorporated into new production models. What began as an unauthorized fix became official doctrine. Between April and December 1943, Fighter Command recorded a 42% reduction in visibility-related incidents compared to the previous winter. Collisions decreased. Disorientation cases fell. Cold injuries declined. Pilot confidence improved. Sortie completion rates rose. Pilots remained on station longer, and bomber escort missions became more effective as fighters maintained formation in poor visibility. Luftwaffe intelligence noticed. German pilots reported that RAF fighters were staying in contact in adverse weather more aggressively, making prior tactics of luring Spitfires into climbs and losing them in clouds less effective. One Luftwaffe report later noted that RAF winter tactics in late 1943 were more assertive, speculating improved training or instrumentation, but it did not mention the quarter-inch gap that made the difference. The modification saved lives in ways that numbers could not capture. Intercepts succeeded because a pilot spotted the enemy a second earlier. Collisions were avoided because wingmen stayed visible. Pilots landed safely because they could see runways through freezing mist. One New Zealand pilot, Carter, wrote in his diary about a mission over the North Sea: heavy overcast, -28 degrees, canopy clear for the entire flight. He described it as a small miracle and thought of the rigger who had made the cut, hoping someone had thanked him. Holloway never sought recognition. Promoted to squadron leader, he was assigned to technical liaison duties, traveling between stations, troubleshooting modifications, and advising on field engineering. Methodical and quiet, he continued as always. Pilots remembered him. Ground crews remembered him. After the war, veterans speaking of what had kept them alive mentioned Holloway not as a hero, but as a problem solver, the man who noticed what others missed. In 1947, the Royal Aeronautical Society published a technical paper on cockpit airflow management, crediting Holloway's modification as a foundational example of passive environmental control. The paper, precise and academic, did not reference the night shifts, unauthorized cuts, or personal risks, but acknowledged the outcome: a simple gap, a controlled draft, and thousands of missions made possible. Holloway left the RAF in 1946, returned to Coventry, and spent 2 decades designing industrial ventilation systems, never again working on aircraft. He rarely discussed the war, mentioning only his role as a maintenance officer, long hours, and the cold. Asked about the canopy alteration, he would shrug, calling it common sense, claiming someone would have eventually figured it out. Pilots knew better. Common sense is rarely common in combat. Reasoned decision-making under pressure is exceptional, and the courage to bend rules to save lives is extraordinary. In 1968, at an RAF Tangmere reunion, Holloway attended modestly, sitting at the back while veterans recounted survival stories. At the evening's close, one pilot raised his glass, declaring that many of them would not have survived without a maintenance officer who realized a quarter-inch gap could make all the difference. The room stood in respect. Holloway nodded quietly, uneasy with attention, thanking them for their service. He passed away in 1979 at age 71, in his hometown. His obituary highlighted his engineering career, RAF service, and modest demeanor, but not canopy fogging, Spitfires, or the innovation that saved countless lives. Yet in RAF Museum archives, under Field Modifications 1943, a memorandum from a wing commander to the Air Ministry dated May 1943 exists, recommending that Warrant Officer Peter Holloway be commended for initiative and technical ingenuity in resolving a critical operational problem. A note in a different hand reads, "This man saw what we did not." The Holloway Gap remains a celebrated case study in military engineering, taught in engineering programs as an example of elegant problem-solving and referenced in manuals on human factors and environmental design. It stands as a testament: war is waged with machines, but won by people who refuse to accept that challenges are insurmountable, those who trust observation over rigid doctrine, who recognize that a small adjustment at the right moment can shift outcomes. Holloway did not invent new materials or aircraft, but confronted a problem deemed inevitable and refused to accept that conclusion. He saw condensation where others saw inevitability, airflow where others felt only cold, and a solution where others saw only rules. Because of that, thousands of pilots returned home through winter skies with clear canopies, steady hands, and a fighting chance. Not all heroes take to the air, some remain on the ground, file in hand, quietly changing the course of history.